I'm going to answer the top questions landlords ask me when selling their rental property. My name's Daniel Hale. I'm a licensed real estate agent and I work with a ton of landlords, which means I sell a lot of tenanted properties, and I'm going to answer the top questions I get asked almost every single day. Can I evict my tenant before selling my rental property? The answer is no. The tenant does have the right to stay inside the rental property during the sale process. However, you can work out an agreement with them, and if they do agree, then you can sign an N11, which is a notice for the landlord and the tenant to end the tenancy, in which case they can move out before the sale. But if the tenant chooses to, they absolutely have the right to remain in the property during the sale. How much notice do I need to give my tenant when selling my rental property? You don't need to give your tenant any notice at all. That's the truth. You have the right as a landlord to put your property up for sale whenever you want. Now, I don't recommend this to landlords, however. I always tell people, give them at least a week's notice. If you just go over to the house and you slap the for sale sign on the front lawn, they look out the window, they see it and find out you only gave them a few days or 24 hours notice, they're not going to be too happy, and it starts things off in a bad direction. You want to try to keep things civil, give them at least a week notice so that they can weigh out their options as well, because at the end of the day, there's a chance that they might have to relocate. How much notice do I have to give my tenant for showings? You must give your tenant 24 hours notice for all showings. If you try to book a showing within the 24 hours, you have to ask that tenant and get their permission. However, they do have the right to deny the showing if you don't give them 24 hours notice. What happens if a tenant denies access to a showing? If the tenant denies a showing and does not let that potential buyer into the property, you have the right to serve them an N5 notice for interference. The tenant does not have the right to deny showings unless you didn't give them 24 hours notice. Now, you need to make sure that you're serving the tenant the notice correctly, otherwise your N5 notice will actually be void if it does go to the landlord and tenant board. For example, there's a little checkbox on the lease that states that the landlord and tenant agree to serve notices through email. If that's checked off as yes, you can deliver your showing notices through email. If that's checked off through no or not acknowledged at all, technically, you have to post a notice on that tenant's door and the appropriate notice that's given by the landlord and tenant board to make sure that that notice was served correctly. Can I ask my tenant to leave during showings? No, you cannot ask your tenant to leave during showings. They do have the right to stay in the property during the showings. Now, some tenants, however, don't like to be there during showings, in which case you can continue to show the property. Now, if the tenant sends you a message and says, hey, I'm not home during that showing time, please reschedule. You do not have to reschedule that showing. You can let the tenant know that they don't have to be home for the showing, and you are allowed to give access to that agent and their potential buyers, provided you've given the right notice. Can I evict my tenant after I sell the property? This question is one I get asked all the time. Now, it depends on who your buyer is. If the buyer is purchasing the property for their own personal use, you have the right to serve the tenant an N12 notice of eviction for the buyer's personal use. Now, you need to make sure that the tenant is not on a fixed term lease. If they are, they have the right to finish off their fixed term lease, and you cannot serve this notice until 60 days before that lease is up or after their lease is done. Now, if you're gonna serve an N12 notice of eviction for a buyer's personal use, you also have to make sure that you serve it on the appropriate dates with the appropriate 60 days, and it has to be served to them correctly. So make sure, if you don't know what you're doing, I highly recommend you hire a paralegal to do that for you. It's also important to note that the tenant does have the right to a hearing if they choose to go that direction. So you need to make sure that you have the appropriate clauses in your agreement of purchase and sale to keep you protected. Now, if it is an investor buying the property, you cannot evict the tenant. The investor must assume the tenancy, or you can come to an agreement with that tenant, which is called cash for keys, where some landlords will assist their tenant financially to assist them with a new place, in which case the tenant and landlord would sign an N11 in agreement to end the tenancy. Otherwise, you cannot sell it to an investor and promise vacant possession. This could get you in a lot of trouble, and it's something that the landlord and tenant board absolutely doesn't like. So be very careful in situations like that. What happens if my tenant doesn't move out on the completion date? This is the most common question I get asked all the time, and I see this nightmare happen sometimes where the landlord hires a real estate agent or sells the property and doesn't understand that the tenant has the right to a hearing and they promise the vacant possession on the closing date. This is a big mistake that can cost you a lot of money and also get you in litigation problem, which you do not want. So never promise vacant possession on the closing date ever. You need to make sure that in the agreement of purchase and sale, it states that you have the right to extend the closing date until the landlord can provide a vacant possession. This means if the tenant chooses not to leave on the 60 days notice that you've given them with the N12, you have the right as the landlord to extend the agreement until your landlord and tenant board hearing has been heard, which will keep you protected, and it'll also make sure that you avoid all litigation issues and you can actually get vacant possession of the property for the buyer. Now, I bet you're also asking, how many people are gonna do that? That's insane. I do this all the time. I just make sure that everything in the agreement of purchase and sale protects the landlord so that there's no issues, and trust me, buyers will still fall in love with the property. It could take a lot more showings than normal, but you absolutely can sell the property with an N12 notice of eviction and sell it successfully. What notice do I serve my tenant when the property is sold? I did touch on this a little bit, but it is a common thing that you have to understand and what you must know when selling a tenanted property. The N12, that notice is for the buyer's personal use, the buyer's child's personal use, the buyer's mother's personal use, or their caregiver, or themselves. There's options on that N12 that you can select and serve to the tenant. The N11 is the notice to end the tenancy. Just understand you can't just give the tenant an N11 and force it on them. You have to have an agreement with them. Maybe they just want additional time to move out so that they have enough time to find a place. Maybe you assist them financially with a cash for keys offer. Whatever that is, you would use the N11. And the other option is maybe somebody buys the property as an investment for themselves and they assume the tenancy, which is a happy scenario that works out for both parties. Now lastly, the most important one, can I still sell my tenanted property for top dollar with a tenant in it? The answer is yes. Absolutely. You just need to make sure that you have somebody that understands how to sell a tenanted property and they've sold tenanted properties before. The reason for this is because there is a buyer for every single property. Somebody will fall in love with that property, which recently, on many occasions, I've had couples that are starting a family with a child on the way, and they're willing to wait 6 months to get that property vacant for them to move in, because it's more convenient for them at the time for them to live with their parents or wherever they're gonna live right now while they wait for that vacant possession. Now, why I say 6 months is because you can have 60 days for the serving and you can have another 4 months for the hearing, and then you get your vacant possession that the board grants. Or you get somebody that buys the property that assumes the tenancy, you have an N11 agreement, but you need to hold firm on your purchase price because there's a lot of buyers out there. It only takes one person to fall in love with that property, and if you have to do a lot of showings just to get somebody to fall in love with it, just be patient. Somebody will absolutely still give you a great price for your home. Don't sell it for a lot less just because there's a tenant in it. You can still sell it for top dollar. And if you're looking to sell your tenanted property, just shoot me an email, send me a text, or give me a call. I'd be happy to help you. And you can watch my video right here on the process of how to sell a tenanted home. And I'll see you guys in the next video.